What family secret was finally spilled in your family? Story 1. My grandma didn't drive. I always thought she couldn't, but it was never discussed. One day when I was around 7 or 8, I kept trying to convince someone, anyone, to drive me to the store for candy. We were visiting my aunt and uncle, and grandma lived with them. The local store sold bit of honey, a candy I couldn't find at home anymore, but no one would take me. Finally, I said I'd just ask grandma, and my cousin chimed in, "Grandma can't drive." "Oh, you bet your sweet self I can drive. They just don't let me." Grandma had overheard, and she was clearly offended. That was the end of the conversation, though. My aunt eventually took me to the store, and I forgot about it. Years later, after I got my driver's license, I asked my mom why Grandma didn't drive. She explained that during Prohibition, Grandma had been a bootlegger, transporting alcohol for moonshiners. She was incredibly good at it, so good. In fact, that when the moonshiners were caught, even though the authorities never caught her, the state suspended her license indefinitely, never to be reissued. Later, she was told she could petition to get it back, but only if she admitted guilt. Grandma told them to go to hell. Story 2. My aunt wasn't my grandfather's biological child. He met my granny when my aunt was a very sick infant. She had polio and wasn't expected to survive. My granddad married my granny so she could access his insurance and move to an area with proper medical care. My aunt became the first infant to survive open-heart surgery at Yale New Haven Hospital. Although she spent most of her childhood in leg braces, she lived a great, though unfortunately too short life. My granddad loved her, as if she were his own, and I never knew she wasn't biologically his until she attended her biological father's funeral when I was a teenager. Story 3. I started having issues with my teeth, spontaneous abscesses that led to multiple root canals. My dentist decided to investigate and discovered some unusual abnormalities with the roots and nerves of my incisors, the teeth causing me all the trouble. He reached out to a couple of professors for guidance. At my next appointment, he was visibly uncomfortable and struggled to explain what he had learned. It turns out my dental issues were a classic sign of inbreeding, and he found it awkward to tell me. When I asked my mom about it, she casually said, "Oh, well, yeah, didn't you know?" Of course I didn't know. Turns out not too far back in our family tree, several relatives thought it was a great idea to marry each other. To make matters worse, the small town where I live is 85% made up of my relatives. No joke. There are so many of them that I haven't even met them all. Story 4. After my mom passed away, I learned the truth about my parents' marriage. She had visited my father's country to see some relatives. After just 1 week of knowing my dad, she asked him to marry her so she could stay in the country. My father agreed because he was alone, and his parents were pressuring him to get married. The surprising part of the story is that over time, they fell deeply in love. Their bond only grew stronger, and they were genuinely happy together. During her final days when she was very ill, she would only allow my father to stay by her side. To this day, he says she was an angel sent by God to take care of him. I was shocked to learn how quickly they had decided to get married, but their love story inspires me. I can only hope to have a marriage as beautiful and loving as theirs. Story 5. My mother had a child when she was a teenager, and she gave him up for adoption to another family. Afterwards, she went to college, earned her degree, married my father, and had my 4 siblings and me. About 30 years after giving her child up, I remember her receiving a phone call and immediately locking herself in her room. I was around 12 at the time. I felt scared because I could hear her crying, but she didn't want to talk to anyone about it. Later that week, my parents gathered all of us kids and shared my mom's story. They explained that my half-brother had reached out, wanting to meet her and get to know her. My dad had known about this since their college days, and my oldest sister had been told earlier. However, the rest of us, and all of my dad's side of the family, grandma, aunts, uncles, etc., had no idea. Coming from a fairly religious and conservative family, it was shocking news at first. Mom flew out with her sisters to meet my half-brother in the state where he lived. Both were nervous, but by the end of the trip, they had begun to rebuild a relationship. Eventually, my siblings and I got to meet him too. Fast forward to now, he's moved to our state, and we see him more often. He's in all of our family pictures, joins us for holidays and birthdays, and is considered part of the family. We're a very close-knit and outgoing family, while he's more reserved, so sometimes he's a bit distant, but we respect his space. Mom stays in close contact with him, and we love when he can join us for family dinners. At the time, I was the youngest and the only boy in the family, so learning I had an older brother was exciting. Now that I'm an adult, I even get some of his old clothes since we're about the same size, and he has great taste, so I lucked out. I'm so glad this family secret came to light, allowing us to welcome my brother into our lives. Story 6. When I was 28, I found out my dad wasn't my biological father. Here's how it happened. My dad was battling depression and experiencing suicidal thoughts, so I flew home to take care of him and try to shield him from my mom's harsh treatment. Throughout their relationship, my mom had been verbally and emotionally abusive. My dad loved her deeply and endured it all. During a quiet walk together, as I tried to support him, he confided in me that he wasn't my biological father. He revealed that my mom had lied to him, trying to convince him he was. He always knew he wasn't, but he chose to step into the role of being my dad. When I was 10 years old, my mom finally admitted the truth to him. He was worried it might affect his relationship with me, but he made sure it didn't. He told me that one of his proudest moments was realizing, as he tucked me in that night, that nothing could ever change how much he loved me or our bond as father and son. During that same conversation, he also shared that my mom had used hard drugs while pregnant with me. It broke his heart to witness, but they were very poor, and life was hard. My dad grew up in foster care without parents. My mom came from a family of 7 children with parents who struggled to provide for them. She dropped out of school in 9th grade, and her siblings dropped out even earlier. Most of them are barely literate. Now, in my mid-30s, I look back on that moment with my dad as a gift. Tragically, he passed away by suicide in March 2020, just as COVID-19 was beginning. I was out of the country but flew back immediately, enduring a 30-hour trip with a short layover just in time for his funeral. Everything I do now is in his honor. He will always be my dad, and I'll forever be grateful for the love and strength he gave me. Story 7. My uncle served in Vietnam. While he was there, his troop found a baby who had either been orphaned or abandoned. They weren't sure which. My uncle was about to ship back to Australia and wanted to adopt the baby, but my aunt said no. They'd only been married for about 4 months when he was drafted, so while I don't agree with her decision and generally don't like her as a person, I can understand her reasoning. My uncle's troop eventually found a family to raise the baby, and that's the story the whole family knows. The secret, however, is that my uncle and a few other guys from his troop stayed in contact with the family and the child. They sent money every month to help raise him, then later to support his university education, and eventually helped him and his adoptive family move to Australia in the late 90s. My aunt and the rest of our family had no idea. It all came to light in 2017 when my aunt and uncle divorced, and she hired a forensic accountant to go through their finances. My aunt had worked at a bank for over 40 years and had always noticed the missing money, but my uncle's explanations had always seemed legitimate. Now that the truth is out, my uncle has introduced some of us to the man and his family. They're all wonderful people. Story 8. I grew up in a Mexican family and have 2 younger cousins. My aunt married another Latino man who looked almost white. Their first child, a girl, looked exactly like her father. No question about it. Their second child, a boy, looked different. He was very dark-skinned. I'm half black, and he was even darker than me. His mom had a darker complexion too, so at the time, no one thought much of it. Fast forward 16 years. By this point, my aunt and uncle were divorced and hated each other. The daughter was always treated like a princess, while the boy was also spoiled but constantly sought his father's approval, which he never seemed to get. One day, the boy's dad had enough and told him outright, "You're not my kid. Your mom cheated, and I don't know who your dad is." He even offered to do a paternity test. The boy's mother never addressed the issue. She ignored it completely, hoping it would go away. We later found out his biological father was Pacific Islander. There was even a family friend who had been a constant presence over the years, but a paternity test ruled him out. To this day, we still don't know who his real father is. His mother claims she doesn't even know. Story 9. When my paternal grandfather passed away, the federal government offered to give him a state funeral. He had been a career Army officer and a colonel, so we didn't think much of it. But when the funeral took place, it was over the top. An elaborate procession with notable attendees, including department heads, senators, retired senators, and representatives from the CIA and State Department. We were completely baffled. It turns out my grandfather had been a significant figure in the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, during World War II. When the OSS split into the CIA and Secret Service, he joined the Secret Service. He wasn't on White House detail but worked covertly in an office focused on counterfeiting and currency. He eventually went blind when I was a toddler and retired, claiming to have been in the army. For reasons unknown, he never shared his covert work with anyone except my grandmother, who was sworn to secrecy. Not even my father knew. He grew up thinking his dad was just a colonel working on a base. After his death, we received a trove of materials, publications, lectures, and other documents detailing his extraordinary career. To me, he was just a blind old man who smoked, drank, and was perpetually grumpy. Turns out he was a true badass and none of us had a clue. Story 10. When my father passed away, I was 17. During the viewing at the funeral home, a young woman showed up with her boyfriend. She looked a couple of years older than me. None of us recognized her, so someone asked why she was there. She said she had come to see her father. My siblings and I were confused, and my mom just stood there shaking her head. My uncles asked the young woman to leave, and she walked out in tears, supported by her boyfriend. Afterward, my mom took us to a private area and explained that our father had an affair years ago, and the young woman was our half-sister. I never learned her name, and we've never met her since. To this day, it bothers me deeply that she was rejected and denied the chance to grieve at her father's funeral. This happened over 40 years ago, but I still feel like I owe her an apology on behalf of my family. Story 11. My mom cheated on my dad with my now stepfather. My parents divorced when I was very young, around 1 year old, so I don't remember anything about it. When I asked as a curious kid why they split up, both of them told me they just fell out of love. However, I always suspected that wasn't the full story because my grandma once mentioned that the divorce happened in 1996, but my mom and stepfather started dating in 1995. On my 18th birthday, my stepfather privately confessed that they had an affair back then. He admitted he still feels guilty because he believes he broke up our family. I reassured him that it was okay because everyone is happy now, and I had already suspected the truth. Years later, my stepmother told me another part of the story. My mom had kicked my dad out without giving him a reason. She told him she needed a break. At the time, she had a newborn, me, and my dad could barely see me in the beginning. My dad only found out later, through the landlord, that my stepfather had moved into the house he used to rent with my mom, the house where his baby daughter was now living with a stranger. To this day, I don't know how my dad managed to handle that without starting a huge fight. I've never brought it up with my parents. There was one time, though, when my mom started ranting about a neighbor who left her husband for another man. I told her she shouldn't throw stones while living in a glass house. She definitely understood what I meant. Story 12. Everyone knew my great-grandpa had cheated on my great-grandma many times, but we never knew if he had illegitimate children. When my great-grandma passed away, my great-grandpa followed a year later. Their only living child, my great-aunt, was the executor of their estate. While reviewing their documents, she noticed about 20 names listed as specifically excluded from the inheritance. Since the family was wealthy and had taken in foster children when my great-aunt was young, she recognized most of the names. They were foster children who had been deliberately excluded. However, one name stood out. It turned out to be the name of my great-grandpa's son from an affair. After some research, my great-aunt was able to locate his mother and notify her that the son was excluded from the estate. My great-aunt suspected the son didn't know they were half-siblings, and she didn't want to be the one to tell him. She was right. The mother had never told her son. To this day, he still believes his now-deceased stepfather was his biological father. The craziest part? That illegitimate son had 2 daughters who ended up going to high school with my brother. Story 13. My grandfather learned a shocking family secret shortly before his death in 2017. He had always been proud of his middle name, which he was given in honor of his maternal grandfather. He signed his name with his middle initial his entire life. Before he passed, he discovered that his grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, had gone missing for a decade during his life. It turns out he was in prison for raping his daughters, excluding my great-grandmother, the eldest. My great-grandmother knew about it and still gave her father's name to her son, my grandfather. When my grandfather learned the truth, he stopped using his middle initial but didn't get the chance to legally drop his middle name before he died. I had once planned to pass down my grandfather's middle name to one of my children. Now I'm grateful I didn't. My grandfather was a good man, but I have no desire to carry forward any part of that dark legacy. Story 14. When my siblings were little, my parents used to grow weed in the basement. I was either a baby at the time or not yet born. The secret came out years later when my dad sent my sister a photo of her as a child, happily standing in front of a bunch of marijuana plants. She asked him about it in an email, but he ignored the question. He told me all about it, though. Apparently, my dad was between jobs and had visited family in California. One of his relatives was growing weed, so my dad took some cuttings and brought them back to New York. He rigged the electrical wiring to steal power directly from the grid, avoiding a noticeable spike in the utility bill from the grow lights. They grew both marijuana and tomatoes and told the kids everything was tomatoes. My dad sold the weed in bulk to a contact at the local airport where he flew recreationally. He used the money to move the family to a new state and start a business. Story 15. My cousin married her high school boyfriend, and they had 2 children together. It wasn't until the youngest child's high school graduation party that the truth came out. They were actually cousins. The husband was the result of an ongoing affair between a farmer's wife and the farmer's farmhand, who was my great-uncle. On the same side of the family, my grandmother had 14 children from 3 different husbands, or so we thought. It recently came to light that she had 3 additional children who were given up for adoption. One of those children was the result of an affair between my grandmother and the foreman of a lumberjack crew. At the time, she owned a bar where the crew would occasionally come down from up north to drink. Grandma got pregnant and told the foreman during one of his visits. The next time the crew came down, he wasn't with them. They told her he had accidentally fallen into a mill saw and died. In reality, he had a wife and kids. My grandmother quietly went on a vacation, had the baby, and gave her up for adoption. We only found out because one of my aunts took a DNA test. Story 16. My father, who is slowly succumbing to Alzheimer's, has always been considered a hard case by those who knew him in New Zealand. Growing up in the 1990s, I saw that he had many quirks. He had epilepsy, a short temper, and an incredibly literal way of understanding things. He was, in short, a hard man to know. For most of my life, I was told he had suffered severe sunstroke as a child, which caused a significant change in him. Later, another story emerged. He had hit his head hard diving into a swimming pool. The truth only came out a decade ago, after my step-grandmother passed away. My grandfather, deeply affected by his experiences in WW2, had returned from the war an angry man. He married my grandmother, and they raised their family in tough circumstances. My grandmother passed when my dad was 12. As a teenager, my dad's smart mouth pushed my grandfather over the edge. One day, my grandfather snapped and beat him severely. So severely that my dad bled from his ears. That beating likely caused a traumatic brain injury, fundamentally altering his behavior for the rest of his life. Now, we know his behavior is not due to autism or any other condition, but rather the long-term effects of that injury. His entire life was shaped by his father's anger, which in turn was shaped by the trauma of war. I've resolved to break this cycle of anger for my own children and reflect often on how the legacy of WW2 shaped my family's history. Story 17. My great-grandmother co-signed a loan for my parents to buy a mobile home in a nice park where we could live. Unfortunately, my mom was terrible with money, and my dad was too lazy to take charge of the finances. They failed to pay the lot rent, and we lost the mobile home. Because my great-grandmother's name was still on the loan, the finance company started withdrawing money from her bank account to cover the payments on a mobile home we no longer had. A week later, my parents took us to a fair where my uncle confronted them. My great-grandmother had been unable to pay some of her bills because of what my parents had done. I was only 5 years old at the time and had no idea what was going on, but I now realize how much my great-grandmother suffered because of their irresponsibility. I have a relationship with my parents today, but I can't forgive them for what they did to her. My great-grandmother was the kindest, sweetest woman I've ever known. She didn't deserve that. I miss you, Grandma. Story 18. My grandmother on my mom's side got pregnant at 16. She was forced to travel halfway across the country to give birth in secret and return as if nothing had happened. This secret came to light before I was born. Both my grandmother and her 2 other children always wanted to find the sibling, but due to legal barriers, they were unable to. 6 or 7 years ago, my uncle received a phone call from the adopted child, who had decided to search for his biological family after the passing of his adoptive parents. Sadly, his biological mother, my grandmother, had passed away in 2001. Despite this, he has become a welcome member of our family. Before COVID, he would visit annually, but those visits had to stop temporarily due to the pandemic. On my dad's side of the family, a great-great-aunt, my dad's mother's brother's wife, also secretly gave up a child as a teenager. 2 years ago, at my great-great-uncle's birthday party, his wife's adopted child attended. This was news to my dad and me, though the closer family members had known for a while. We're a big and relatively close family, but only see distant relatives on special occasions. Unfortunately, a year later, my great-great-aunt passed away. At her funeral, I noticed her biological children sat up front, while the adopted daughter sat toward the back. She wasn't mentioned in the obituary, which made me feel bad. I don't know the details. Perhaps it was what my great-great-aunt wanted. But I couldn't help but feel that the adopted daughter wanted to be acknowledged as part of the family, especially if she attended birthday parties. Story 19. My mom's mother was actually her grandmother, while her oldest sister was, in fact, her biological mother. Apparently, my mom's biological mom got pregnant at 18, unwed, and her parents decided to cover it up. They sent her away until she gave birth and then pretended the baby was theirs. Her father was a military officer, and this happened in the 1940s, so it was considered deeply shameful at the time. My mom had no idea. The family members who knew never told her, and her birth certificate was falsified. How did this come to light? When I was in 8th grade, I had to do a family history project. My mom called some relatives to help, and one of her older cousins accidentally let something slip. That led my mom to suspect the truth about her birth. She confronted her biological mom, who was deeply upset. Her bio mom had been shamed into silence by her parents, while my mom was raised by people who treated her poorly. She always felt unwanted growing up. Now my mom feels relieved because her difficult childhood finally makes sense. She and her biological mom were always close, having been raised as sisters. Thankfully, they are on good terms again, and my mom visited her last week. Story 20. We recently discovered that about 40 years ago, my grandfather had a 7-year-long affair with a woman from his church. She was also married. During the affair, they had 2 children together, but they kept it secret. The woman pretended the children were her husband's, even though they looked nothing like him. How we found out was unexpected. A few years ago, I did a 23andMe DNA test to explore my ethnic background. My aunt and uncle had also done the test about a year earlier. One feature of 23andMe is that it shows you DNA matches with relatives. A few days after Christmas, a woman reached out to my aunt and uncle, explaining that 23andMe had identified them as her half-siblings and me as her nephew. Coming from a strict Catholic family, she was understandably confused and concerned. They met to piece together the story and then confronted their parents. At first, my grandparents denied everything, but eventually, they confessed. It's been hard on the family. For a long time, my grandfather refused to apologize to anyone, including my grandmother, for the pain he caused. But he eventually did. Shockingly, despite everything, my grandparents are still together. Story 21. Ever since I was a kid, my grandmother on my mom's side always acted strangely at dinner. If you were looking at a menu, she'd peek over to see what entree you were considering and say, "Wow, that sounds good. Can I split that with you?" It wasn't just entrees. The same thing happened with appetizers, drinks, literally everything. "Hey, want to try my soda?" she'd ask. It always struck me as odd and somewhat annoying, especially since I don't like sharing food. Even stranger, she would watch you eat intently and wouldn't take a bite of her own food until you had swallowed yours. Several years ago, she became estranged from our family for a number of reasons. Gambling, constantly asking for money, harassment, and most notably, her past abuse of my mom when she was growing up. Curious about her odd behavior, I asked my mom why Grandma acted that way during meals. That's when I learned the truth. My grandmother was paranoid about her food being poisoned. She refused to eat or drink until someone else tested it first. Looking back, it's unsettling to think that she might have genuinely believed her food was poisoned and had me test it for her, waiting to see if I'd drop dead or have some kind of reaction. Love you too, Grandma. Story 23. My father passed away when I was 7 years old, shortly after a bitter and contentious divorce from my mother. We never attended his funeral. To this day, I'm 36 now. I've never even visited his grave, though I hope to change that soon. Growing up, my siblings and I were told by my mother that our father didn't want us. She claimed he had sent us away so he could enjoy his life with his new wife and baby son, our stepbrother. I hated him for decades, believing he had cruelly abandoned us to live in poverty and endure the abuse of our mother. My mom would tell us stories about how he'd leave us outside in the cold if we misbehaved, and how he only fed us scraps like a single hot dog or a small can of beans for the 3 of us, while giving his other son the best food and toys. I couldn't remember any of it, so I believed her. Ironically, while accusing him of abuse, she would leave us alone for months at a time, beat us with tree branches, or tell us we were her biggest regret. Thank God for my older sister. Without her, I don't think I would have survived. 5 years ago, while planning my wedding, I decided to reconnect with my little brother, my dad's youngest child. I found him on Facebook and we reconciled. None of what happened was his fault. He was just a baby. When he visited us, we talked about our father, whom we all thought was abusive. My brother, however, seemed genuinely confused by what we were saying. It turns out the truth was very different. After the divorce, my mom manipulated the legal system by seducing a high-powered lawyer to sue for full custody of us. My dad, a poor Southern man, couldn't afford to fight back. We discovered that not only was everything we'd been told about our father a lie, but he had fought tirelessly until the day he died to see us or get us back. We didn't attend his funeral because my mom claimed he didn't want us there. She told us it was written in his will, which was absurd. He died suddenly of a heart attack and never had time to write such a will. We later learned he had sent us letters, gifts, and voicemails, all of which my mom intercepted and destroyed. My stepmother, a kind and wonderful woman, kept court documents, letters, photos, and home videos, proof of his love and devotion to us, in the hope that one day we would learn the truth. Sometimes I think about what must have gone through his mind as he died. Did he think about us? Did he feel like he failed us? Did the stress of losing us contribute to his early death? I feel so guilty knowing the lies I believed about him. If he knew what we thought of him, I think it would have broken his heart. It feels good to know he loved us. But it doesn't change the fact that I can't talk to him now. I can't ask for advice, share my problems, or feel his hug. It's the same emptiness I've always felt, and I think that's the saddest part. I don't know if there's a heaven or an afterlife, but I hope that somehow he knows I'm sorry for believing those lies. I'd give anything to talk to him, even for just a moment, or to feel what his hug was like. Story 24. Last week, I was talking with my dad and stepmom and finally revealed how I hacked, their words not mine, the family computer password when I was a teenager. They used to lock the computer while they were at work, but as a teenager, I wanted to browse MySpace and Facebook instead of doing schoolwork, so they put a password on it. Unfortunately for them, their passwords were incredibly weak. It was usually something like my dad's first initial and last name, which is also mine since I'm a junior. I figured that out easily. When they changed it to something like my stepmom's and dad's initials, I still cracked it. Then they capitalized the initials, but even that wasn't enough. Finally, my grandpa suggested they use a USB device that locked the PC when it wasn't plugged in. That was a bit more of a challenge, but I figured out how to bypass it. There was a 30-second window of inactivity after a restart. So I'd restart the computer, press CTRL plus ALT plus DL to open the task manager, and kill the locking program right as it was about to start. When I finished using the computer, I'd restart it so the lock would work as usual. They knew I was somehow getting in, but couldn't figure out how, and never asked me. They just assumed I was hacking. Ironically, if they'd just asked, I would have told them. Now, 13 years later, while visiting them and my grandma, they brought up how I used to hack into their computer. I finally broke the news that it wasn't hacking. It was weak passwords and a basic understanding of Windows programs. Funny enough, I'm now studying cybersecurity and hope to work in penetration testing someday. Story 25. When I was 13, my two older sisters and I flew to our hometown to visit our mom and extended family. We started by staying at our aunt's house for a few days, which was fine at first. Then, out of the blue, our cousin showed up to stay with us too. At first it was okay. We caught up reluctantly with her while enjoying time with our aunt and uncle. One day, we all decided to walk to a park nearby. That's when my sisters and cousins started talking about smoking weed and wishing they had some. I wasn't interested and didn't think they'd actually get any. But my cousin claimed she had friends who could hook them up. Later that evening after dinner, the house alarm blared. It turned out my cousin had asked a friend to bring weed and pass it through a window. What she didn't realize was that the window was wired to the alarm system. My uncle stormed in, furious. The rest of the night was tense, and we were sent to bed early. The next morning, while my sisters and I made breakfast, our aunt was in a private discussion with my uncle and cousin. When she emerged, she told us we couldn't stay at her house anymore. She had already called our mom to pick us up, saying she didn't want anything happening while she was at work. We were upset and confused about why we were being kicked out. Drama unfolded as the family heard different rumors, but the only explanation we got was that she didn't want accidents happening. Years later, I found out the truth. My cousin told our aunt that my sisters and I had tried to sell our bodies for cigarettes at the park and planned to sneak out that night to do it again. My aunt believed her. To this day, it hurts to think about how unfairly we were treated and how someone I admired could believe such a terrible lie. I don't talk to that side of the family anymore. And as for my cousin, I have nothing to say to her. Story 26. When I was a kid, we didn't hear much about our family's history in Louisiana. My grandmother was one of 11 children, and they grew up on a sugarcane farm before moving to Tulsa during the Great Depression. That's all I knew. A few years ago, During a family gathering, my aunt and I got into an argument about removing Confederate monuments. She pulled me aside and shared a family story she thought would change my perspective. She revealed that one of our great-great-grandfathers was the son of a Confederate soldier who had defected, been captured, and later released. When he returned home, he was tried and hanged for desertion. This left his sick wife and their